Hey everybody, welcome back to Daytime. Dr. David Teplin is back on the set. He is an adult clinical psychologist, good friend of mine. Teps, welcome back to the show, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.
Listen, a pleasure to have you here. And unfortunately, we've got to ruin it for all the Walking Dead fans out there. There is no such thing as zombies, regardless of what's happening in the real world. But there are some really dangerous drugs out there that are making people go, I believe the word is haywire.
Right. So I think you're referring to what we're talking about today, which is bath salts.
Thank you for clarifying that to everybody at home.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Okay, so just for those at home, bath salts isn't the same as Epsom salts,
right,
or something that you relax in while settling down after a hard day.
Right. It's not something you go buy at the body shop.
No, but it is something you can get off the internet or a head shop. And a head shop, if you don't know what that is a store that sells drug paraphernalia.
Okay, and the reason we're talking about this is because recently in Miami, there was a horrific scene where somebody went crazy on bath salts.
Right.
I'm not going to go too much into it, but the fact is that this drug really has the effect of making people go haywire.
Absolutely. So bath salts is really a designer drug, which is a fancy term for homemade in a lab, a concoction. And it's really a mix of amphetamine or stimulant-like substance like a cocaine.
Yeah.
And it also is a bit of a mix similar to, say, LSD or acid, where it's hallucinogenic. So you get a combination of all of the things that go on with amphetamine as well as hallucinogenic. So you get a combination of things like euphoria, confusion, right, chest pains, paranoia, delusions, hallucinations. You overheat. That's why you saw the story in Miami that the guy had all his clothes off. He was likely overheating from the
right,
drug. High rates of suicide ideation or attempts, and oftentimes making you very hostile, very aggressive.
Yeah. Do we have to be worried as Canadian residents? Because I know bath salts is limited so far in Canada, but I mean, like anything, it's not too far away from becoming an epidemic.
Right. So here's what we know at the moment. Most of the product comes from either China or Europe. It has appeared in different places, including Canada. Mm-hmm. It's certainly not an epidemic at this point. We do need to watch out for it for a number of reasons. Number one is some of the stuff that makes up bath salts are not deemed to be legal yet in Canada, although they are in other countries.
Right.
So Health Canada will need to take a look at whether we ban some of those substances. Number two is always for designer drugs, you're looking at the age group in particular, 15 to 25.
Right.
The other issue is access to internet. We've talked many times that Canada are one of the biggest users of pharmacy and pharmaceuticals on the internet.
Right. I mean, when we're talking about substance abuse and we're talking about a substance that is clearly this terrifying, why would someone turn to a substance like this?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons, but generally speaking, those who are interested in getting a high, getting a buzz, are always interested in the next frontier and what's out there. And it's no different to any of the club drugs that we have, to any of the illicit street drugs that we have. A number of things are more traditional, but a lot of stuff that's out there is really designer, and now, as you know, prescription drugs is the other issue. I just don't want to lose the other point about Canada, and it's this. Typically what we see in a lot of these cases, and bath salts is no exception, that it typically comes off the eastern seaboard in the northeast United States, Maine and places like that, through to eastern Canada. And bath salts is a good example of where most of the exposure, although there is certainly some in the rest of the country, is in eastern Canada.
What do we, for Health Canada, I mean, how quickly should they be moving on this? Because clearly this is something that could explode at any minute. Well,
I mean, potentially any of these things can explode, but it takes these kind of cases to get the authorities to take a look. Health Canada are a very good, firm organization. They know what they're doing. They will likely, and I can't talk for Health Canada, but they will likely consult the FDA and other places as well and do due diligence, and I'm pretty sure that pretty soon this will be taken off the shelf.
Yeah, so the next question is, I mean, we all know the addictiveness of drugs. Is bath salts an addictive drug?
Well, it's a great question. Here's what we know. It hasn't been around long enough to make that determination, but from anecdotal evidence from people coming forward, they certainly talk about getting strong cravings and urges, and if you get strong cravings and urges, it's quite reinforcing.
Yeah. And how do we define a designer drug? Because you've said designer drug a few times. How do we actually define a designer drug?
I think really the quick and dirty definition of designer drug is basically in the lab, at home, concocting a bunch of things put together and seeing what the outcome is.
And I guess it's very limited to Canada, but for a parent at home, I'm sure this is quite terrifying to know that these designer drugs are coming to 18, 25-year-olds. What is the conversation a parent needs to have with their child to sort of understand exactly what it is they could potentially be getting into?
I think to the extent that you can, you want to have open conversations about drugs, alcohol, what the potential fallout and consequences are. You want to talk about if there's a history of addiction in the family, because they're genetic factors. Unfortunately, the 15 to 25-year-old age group, as we've talked before, are often the hardest to reach because often they're going to do their own thing. Peer pressure is a big thing. And it's a rite of passage in many ways, certainly in the Western world, to experiment and be curious about alcohol and drugs. I think what people should know, though, going in is, certainly for bath salts is a good example, we don't have enough information to know where it can go. But we saw with Miami what the possible fallout can be for this kind of thing.
Well, I've seen enough YouTube clips to know that it's not something that people should be getting involved in.